It was May 2000, and at the age of 32, Sheila Davalloo was on her way up in the world. Tall and elegant, with thick black curly hair and a wide smile, Sheila had just landed a new and highly paid job with Purdue Pharmaceutical Company in Stamford, Connecticut. At that time, Purdue Pharma was one of the most successful drug companies in the United States, and so they were only hiring the best and brightest applicants. And Sheila was certainly that. She was absolutely brilliant and held an undergraduate degree in biochemistry as well as a master's degree in public health. But it wasn't just work that was going well in Sheila's life. On May 28th, shortly after she started her new job at Purdue Pharma, managing the company's medical coding department, Sheila got married to her longtime boyfriend, 32-year-old Paul Christos. Paul was just as brilliant as Sheila, having earned several college degrees, including 2 advanced science degrees from New York Medical College, which is located about 40 minutes outside of New York City. And it was while Paul was studying at New York Medical College in 1994 that he met Sheila. She was also studying at the prestigious school. Sheila had joined a small private study group that Paul was leading to help pay his college tuition bills, and quickly the pair realized they had a lot in common. Both of them were extremely smart and well-educated, they both loved science and research, and they both were living with their parents at the time. Paul's mom and dad lived about 20 minutes away in White Plains, New York. Sheila's family lived a little farther north in the wealthy enclave of Yorktown Heights, where the median income was a whopping $100,000. Paul would later say that when he first saw Sheila in his study group, he was instantly attracted to her. There was something exotic about her dark eyes and olive complexion, and he loved the tiny gap between her 2 front teeth. Paul was also impressed that Sheila spoke French and Italian, as well as English. Within a few weeks of meeting each other at the study group, Paul and Sheila started spending more time with each other outside of the group. At first, they were just friends who enjoyed talking with each other and going on walks, but by the time Sheila graduated with her master's degree in 1998, the couple had fallen in love and gotten engaged. The pair wed on May 28th of 2000, right around the time Sheila landed her new job with Purdue Pharma. The wedding had gone off exactly as Sheila had planned, a small celebration with just 70 members of their family and friends. And afterward, the couple returned to the beautiful condo Sheila's parents had recently purchased for them in the upscale little town of Pleasantville, New York, just 40 minutes away from Purdue Pharma in Stamford. The only person who had been missing from the wedding was Sheila's younger and very mentally unstable brother, who suffered from severe schizophrenia. Schizophrenia is a mental illness that can cause episodes of psychosis, delusions, and paranoia. In fact, at Sheila's discretion, her family had not even told her brother that she was getting married. Sheila spent a lot of time with her brother, and she was concerned that if her brother found out that she was married, he might worry that she was going to abandon him. And so, in order to protect her brother, Sheila had said it was important that he didn't meet or see Paul until she and her family were certain he could handle it. And Sheila said that might actually never happen. But as strange as this was, Paul wasn't that concerned. He figured in time he would surely get a chance to meet his brother-in-law and that everything would be fine. So the newly married couple settled into their new life together in their new condo, excited to spend more time together. But pretty much right away, they both got sucked into their respective careers and other interests, and so they actually didn't see each other very much. By September 2000, just 4 months after he and Sheila got married, Paul had started work on another advanced degree, this time a doctorate in epidemiology at Columbia University in New York City. Epidemiology is the study of how often diseases occur in different groups of people and why. In addition to his own studies, Paul was also teaching undergraduate classes 2 evenings a week at Columbia. Meanwhile, Sheila, who was just as ambitious as her husband, threw herself into her new job at Purdue Pharma. She also joined a local volleyball league in order to stay in shape. Neither Paul nor Sheila were ever big socializers or drinkers, but Sheila, in an effort to make some friends at work, had begun joining some of her coworkers at a local bar in the evenings after work. But most nights after work, Sheila preferred to just come home and curl up with a romance novel or watch her favorite TV show, a romance comedy called Friends. Paul would often find his wife fast asleep with a book next to her in bed or on the couch when he came home late from teaching his classes. By spring of 2001, almost a year after she had started at Purdue Pharma and after she and Paul had gotten married, Sheila told Paul that she wanted to start having her brother come by their condo more often so she could spend some time with him. Since her brother still had not been told about Paul, these visits were a major inconvenience because in preparation for them, Paul and Sheila had to make it seem like Paul didn't exist. Sheila would take down all of their wedding pictures and other pictures that had Paul in them, and Paul would have to pack up all of his personal effects and anything else that might be connected to him that was in the condo. And then he would head to the local Marriott hotel where he would stay until the brothers' visit was over. But even though this arrangement seemed kind of outrageous to Paul, he wasn't about to try to convince Sheila to change her mind. Sheila was very protective of her brother and got very emotional anytime Paul brought him up. And so the way Paul saw it was the occasional weekend away was a chance for him to get some marathon sessions of work in, and he'd be making his wife happy. On the rare occasions when Paul and Sheila were actually home together with nothing else to do, Sheila's favorite activity was telling Paul all about the office politics at Purdue Pharma. And Paul welcomed the chance to learn a little bit more about his wife's day-to-day life. Most of Sheila's office stories revolved around small issues she was having with staff in her department, or who was applying for what job, or who was on their way up at Purdue, or who was on their way down. But by the summer of 2001, there was a drama unfolding at Purdue Pharma that Sheila found totally fascinating. And before long, Sheila was talking about this big spectacle, not just to Paul, but to her mom and her dad and her in-laws. And if she and Paul went out to dinner or met up with their own friends outside of their work, she talked about it to them too. It turned out there was a new love triangle at Purdue Pharma that involved one of Sheila's friends, a woman named Melissa, along with another woman named Annalisa and a man named Jack. Sheila was only close with Melissa. Her only interactions with Annalisa and Jack were when she would just pass by them at the office or when she would see them at those after-work happy hours at the local bar. But through Melissa, Sheila would learn a lot about Jack and Annalisa. Jack was 35 years old and had a doctorate of pharmacy, and he worked on researching and developing pain medications. He had started at Purdue Pharma back in September of 2000, so about 5 months after Sheila had started working there, and within a few months of his arrival, he had started dating another coworker, Annalisa, who was 32 years old, and he had met her at one of those meetups at that local bar after work. But not too long after Jack started seeing Annalisa, did he meet Sheila's friend, Melissa, also at one of those after-work happy hours. Annalisa didn't know it, but Jack started dating Melissa too. And even though Melissa was pretty sure Jack was also dating Annalisa, Melissa was so into Jack and so sure that eventually Jack would stop dating Annalisa that she just kept going out with Jack. But despite her confidence, the whole love triangle situation was very hard on Melissa, and the one person at the office that she had started talking to about it was Sheila. And as Melissa shared every intimate detail about her relationship with Jack, the secret meetups, the weekend ski trips and camping trips and wild sex, Sheila and Melissa went from just being good office friends to being best friends. At first, Paul was pretty interested in this love triangle that Sheila kept talking about. He also felt flattered when Sheila began seeking his insights about Jack. Why would Jack see two women at the same time? Why does Jack like one more than the other? Did Paul agree with Melissa that eventually Jack would choose Melissa over Annalisa? Paul's advice for Melissa was just to talk with Jack, or talk with Annalisa and let her know that Jack had been cheating on her. But Sheila told Paul that Melissa still held out hope that Jack would come back to her, and if she told Annalisa that Jack had been cheating on her, then Jack would just be angry at Melissa. Paul started to feel like his wife was just pretty much ignoring all of his advice, and Paul was starting to worry that Sheila was maybe getting a little bit too involved in her friend's drama, because pretty soon it seemed to Paul and to Sheila's other friends that this love triangle was literally all Sheila ever wanted to talk about. It had become like a real-life soap opera, a reality TV show that his wife found much more interesting than her weekly episodes of Friends or her romance novels. Now, when Sheila's brother would come to visit them, Paul couldn't wait to pack up his stuff and head for the Marriott Hotel because he was sick and tired of hearing about Jack and his two girlfriends. But this love triangle drama was only just getting started. In the first half of 2002, two things happened that kicked the gossip mill at Purdue Pharma into high gear. In February, Annalisa, who had worked at Purdue Pharma for several years and was a very popular and promising employee, got a job with another pharmaceutical company in New Jersey called Pharmacia. When this happened, Melissa was very hopeful that Jack would finally just break it off with Annalisa, because Annalisa would likely have to move 2 hours away to where her new office was located. But shortly after getting this new job at Pharmacia, Annalisa had arranged with her new employer to do most of her work from her condo in Stamford and only drive to New Jersey for important meetings. Meaning Annalisa would still be in town and so could still see Jack. And worse than that was that Jack seemed to be getting tired of Melissa. Around the time Annalisa started this new job, Jack told Melissa that he wanted to spend more time with Annalisa, although he did still continue to see Melissa, just not as often. To Melissa, this could mean only one thing. Annalisa must be pressuring Jack to get married and settle down with her. And apparently, that pressure worked because in the summer of 2002, Jack delivered a crushing blow to Sheila's friend Melissa. He told her that he wanted to break off their relationship completely. And Melissa would find out that not long after this breakup, Jack was spending most nights not with his roommates in Stamford, but with Annalisa at her condo that overlooked the Long Island Sound. And now that Annalisa wasn't an employee of Purdue Pharma, she and Jack felt like they could be more open about their deepening relationship. So now Melissa's own coworkers knew that Jack and Annalisa were a couple. And even though Melissa put on a good public show of taking this news in stride, even telling Jack that, oh yeah, what we have was just a fling, Sheila would tell Paul that her friend was actually devastated and humiliated, and that Melissa was having a lot of trouble letting go of her feelings for Jack. Not long after this, Sheila asked Paul if she could have his old pair of night vision binoculars and his eavesdropping equipment. These items were leftovers from Paul's college days when he and his buddies were big fans of The X-Files, the popular 90s science fiction TV show about extraterrestrial life and mysteries that have no rational explanation. When Paul asked Sheila why she needed these things, she told him that Melissa was going to start staking out Annalisa's property to see what she and Jack were up to, and that she, Sheila, was going to go with her, and so Paul's equipment would help them spy on them. Paul was a little alarmed, but considering how intense this love triangle drama seemed to be, he wasn't all that surprised. And so, against his better judgment, he told his wife she was welcome to use his things. In addition to spying on Annalisa's property, Melissa also began listening to Jack's voicemails. She had somehow got his password, and she had even begun using the information she got in his voicemails to show up at places she knew Jack was going to be. Melissa had even arranged one time to run into Jack at an airport and flew back home in the seat right next to him. Periodically, Melissa would forward some of these voicemails to Sheila, and she would ask her to listen closely to see if the messages offered any clues about how serious Jack and Annalisa were as a couple. And whenever Sheila got these messages forwarded to her, she would always ask Paul to come listen to them as well. And even though Paul would humor his wife and listen and give his insights, privately, he started thinking that this whole love triangle situation was getting really out of control. But this drama was still just getting started. One day, Sheila came home with a set of lockpicks that she had picked up for Melissa. Apparently, Melissa had told Sheila that she wanted to get inside of Annalisa's condo to look at any pictures Annalisa had of her and Jack and see if that gave her a better sense of what their relationship was actually like. Also, Melissa wanted to see how much of Jack's stuff was actually inside of Annalisa's apartment. Sheila asked Paul if he would help her learn how to use these lockpicks so she could then teach Melissa when she handed the picks over. Paul did not think breaking into Annalisa's apartment was a good idea, but he didn't think Melissa would actually use them. Still, Paul was relieved when neither he nor Sheila could use the lockpicks to open even the bathroom door, let alone the much more sophisticated lock on their front door. Especially since Sheila also revealed to him that she had also bought her friend 2 stun guns in case Melissa was caught in Annalisa's apartment and needed to defend herself. With the failure of the lockpicks, Sheila and Melissa turned their attention away from how Melissa could get into Annalisa's apartment to how they could possibly bug Jack's office. That way, Melissa wouldn't just be able to hear Jack's voice messages, she could also hear all of his in-person conversations, as well as his end of any phone calls he was taking in his office. But when Melissa tried to set up Paul's eavesdropping equipment near Jack's office, it didn't work. By the fall of 2002, Jack was showing no signs of wanting to leave Annalisa to go back with Melissa, And while this inspired Melissa to up the ante with her surveillance efforts, Sheila, on the other hand, was becoming less interested in the whole thing. It seemed like it might have dawned on her that what they were doing was just not okay and could definitely get them in a lot of trouble. And so in early November of 2002, Sheila started to distance herself from Melissa and basically stopped talking about the love triangle altogether. Paul was happy to be hearing so much less about Melissa and Jack, but he also realized that without that constant source of conversation, Paul felt like he and Sheila were just kind of drifting apart. He knew his own work also had a lot to do with that. That fall, he was in the middle of running a clinical trial for a new cancer drug. On November 13th, he'd had a meeting in Manhattan with one of the drug manufacturers he was working with, a company called Pharmacia. He remembered the meeting for two reasons. The first was during the endless saga about this love triangle at Purdue Pharma, his wife had told him that Annalisa had gotten a job at Pharmacia. The second reason was because during this meeting, the researchers from Pharmacia all seemed very subdued, even though the clinical trial they were talking about actually showed a lot of promise. When Paul asked one of the Pharmacia employees if there was something wrong, the guy said they were all just really shocked at the recent murder of one of their researchers. When Paul got home that evening, he asked Sheila if she'd heard anything about a murder at Pharmacia, because wasn't that the place that Annalisa had gone for her new job? Sheila sat up and said no, she hadn't heard anything about a murder, and as far as she knew, Annalisa was okay. A couple days later, when Paul and Sheila were sitting in silence in their condo, Paul decided to try to strike up a conversation with his wife, and so he asked her, "How's Melissa doing?" Sheila would tell Paul that Jack and Annalisa had actually broken up for good, and that Annalisa had moved to New Jersey, and that now Jack and Melissa were back together and dating each other exclusively. Paul was surprised. He didn't expect Jack and Melissa to ever get back together again, considering how insane Melissa had been. But he figured that if Annalisa had moved to New Jersey, that Jack likely would not have put up with a long-distance relationship, and so maybe that was why things had worked out the way they had. But Paul decided not to ask any more questions, and so he and Sheila just went back to sitting in silence, which was quickly becoming the norm between them. These days, not only was Sheila not talking to Paul, but she was also having her brother come over more often, which of course meant that Paul would have to leave his home more often and stay at the Marriott Hotel. This was becoming totally infuriating for Paul, but he wasn't entirely shocked that as their marriage was clearly beginning to erode, Sheila was turning to her family for comfort and not him. And so Paul told himself that what he really needed to do was just pay more attention to Sheila and try to be a better husband any chance he could. So a few months later, on the late afternoon of Saturday, March 22nd, 2003, when Sheila walked into Paul's home office and told him that she'd heard about this game at work and she really wanted to play it with him, Paul, despite having no clue what this game was, stopped what he was doing and immediately said, "Yes, I'll play." Sheila told him the game was a trust game where each of them would take turns lying on the ground and guessing what objects the other person was pressing against their bodies. To make sure they couldn't cheat, when it was their turn to lie on the floor and guess, they'd have to wear a blindfold, and their hands would also be secured above their head to the rungs of a heavy chair so they couldn't touch the objects they were supposed to identify. As she described this game, they both quickly came to the realization that this game seemed pretty involved and time-consuming. So it wasn't just something they could do right then and there, because they actually had plans that night to go see Sheila's parents. So they decided they would wait until the next day, Sunday, to play this game. But Sunday morning rolled around and it was still too busy to play. Paul had plans to go into Columbia University that morning, and then when he got back, Sheila said they should really go visit Paul's mom out in White Plains. So they both hopped into the car, and 40 minutes later, they were eating a light lunch, drinking tea, and chatting with Paul's mom about the upcoming Academy Awards that would be broadcast that evening. Then they jumped back into the car, and when they arrived back at their condo, Paul took their two dogs out for a walk, and after he got back, Sheila looked at him with a smile and said, "Are you ready to play the game now?" All in all, it had actually been one of their best weekends together in a long time. Conversations were flowing naturally, and they both just seemed happy and upbeat. Also, Sheila had mentioned to Paul that maybe it was time that she and her parents talk to her brother and bring him in on the big family secret that Sheila was married. So even though Paul would have preferred to just relax that afternoon, in fact, he had forgotten all about the game, He knew it was important to Sheila, so he said, "Sure, let's play." Sheila said, "Okay, I'll get the stuff we need." And when she came back to the kitchen a few minutes later, Sheila was holding a pair of black pantyhose and a pair of handcuffs. For just a second, Paul thought maybe Sheila had in mind taking a page out of her friend Melissa's book and staging a steamy sex scene of her own. But when Sheila saw the look on Paul's face, she laughed and told him, no, it wasn't anything like that. It was really just a trust game. No one was taking any clothes off. So at about 4 p.m. that Sunday afternoon, Paul followed Sheila into the spare bedroom where the floor was padded with carpet and where there was a chair with sturdy wooden rungs attached to the legs of the chair. Sheila went first. She put the pillow down on the floor. Then, dressed in her jeans and t-shirt, she lay down on her back with her head on the pillow, and she stretched her arms out above her head so Paul could handcuff her wrists to the rungs of the heavy chair. Then he wrapped the blindfold around her head and asked her if she could see anything. When she said no, Paul started to gather the random objects he was going to test her with. First, he put one of their little dogs against Sheila's side, but she couldn't figure out what it was. Then he put a camera on her chest. She couldn't figure out that one either. The next one was easy. It was just a box, and Sheila guessed it right away. And then after successfully guessing a few more items, Sheila told Paul it was his turn. Glad the game wasn't actually taking very much time, Paul uncuffed Sheila's wrists, and just a few minutes later, Sheila had secured his hands to the chair rung, wrapped the blindfold around his eyes, and asked if he was ready to play. Paul said he was, and then a few moments later, like Paul, Sheila started with the dog, but Paul guessed immediately that it was the dog. Sheila then pressed an ink printer cartridge against his arm and a shampoo bottle against his chest, but Paul was good at this and he got both of them right. After that, Sheila started walking all over the condo, going into every drawer and cabinet, trying to find the most obscure things she possibly could to try to trip him up, but he just kept getting them right. At one point, Paul heard Sheila getting something from the kitchen, and while Paul was actually starting to kind of enjoy the game because he was so good at it, he started to become aware that Sheila was annoyed that he was so good at it. So when he heard Sheila walk back into the room from being in the kitchen, he wasn't surprised when he heard her say, "Okay, this is the last one." Then he heard a little rustling noise, and suddenly he felt Sheila's weight on top of him, kneeling it felt like, so that one of her legs were on either side of his thighs. Then he felt a smooth, cylindrical object pressed against his cheek, and then he smelled wax. Just as Paul opened his mouth to say, "It's a candle," he suddenly felt a huge blow to his chest. It felt like someone had dropped a giant barbell on top of him. And then he heard Sheila scream. On the early afternoon of November 8th, 2002, 4 months before Sheila and Paul played the trust game, the Stamford Police Department received a 911 call from a payphone located near 123 Harbor Drive, a complex of luxury condos overlooking the nearby Long Island Sound. The unidentified caller told police that they had witnessed an assault at one of the condos. They told police to check Unit 105 before ending the call abruptly and hanging up on the dispatcher. A few minutes later, 2 responding police officers who had been patrolling in an area near this complex of condos parked their patrol cars in the residence parking lot, walked up the outside steps to Unit 105, and knocked on the door. When no one answered, police checked the doorknob and found that the door was unlocked. After opening the door just an inch and yelling through the open door, "Stamford Police, is anyone home?" and hearing no response, one of the officers pushed the door open all the way and took a few cautious steps inside. The sight that met his eyes was so shocking and violent that he immediately pulled out his weapon, and before his partner had even stepped across the threshold behind him, the first officer was already on his radio calling for an ambulance and backup. In the hallway that stretched out right in front of these 2 officers lay the body of a young woman. She was still bleeding from blunt force trauma and stab wounds to her face, neck, chest, and head. Barefoot, but dressed in jeans and a white sweater that was soaked with blood. She was sprawled on her back, her one leg stretched out on the floor, the other with the knee bent and propped up against a box. The walls of the condo were splattered with blood, and pools and drops of blood lined the hallway. The 2 police officers knew, even before the EMTs arrived and confirmed it, that this woman was dead. But she hadn't died quickly, and she hadn't died without putting up an epic fight against whoever had attacked her. along with scarlet smears of blood everywhere. The floors were also littered with broken glass and dirt and leaves from overturned plants. There was a laundry basket that had been tipped over, spilling clothes everywhere, and most of the furniture was toppled. There were dishes and silverware all over the kitchen floor, and there were books and other papers scattered about. The apartment was a total wreck. From all the family pictures on the walls, and the young woman's computer, and the wallet inside of her handbag, it didn't take police long to identify the victim. With no sign of forced entry, investigators assumed that the victim must have opened the door for her murderer. Based on the autopsy report that showed 9 separate stab wounds, one of them so deep the tip of the knife penetrated through the woman's chest to the very back of her lung, investigators concluded that one of the motives for this attack must have been pure rage. There was no sign of sexual assault. Police didn't have to look very hard to find their first person of interest. By that evening, the victim's boyfriend, whose clothes and other personal effects were found inside the apartment, had pulled up outside his girlfriend's condo. Once there, he rolled down his car window and asked one of the dozens of law enforcement personnel who'd set up a perimeter outside of the crime scene what was going on. The police asked him to identify himself. He said his name was Nelson Sessler and that he was a research scientist at Purdue Pharmaceuticals in downtown Stamford. He said he had met the victim back in 2000 when they both worked for Purdue Pharma. They had started dating in December of 2000, and then starting in the early fall of 2002, just a few months earlier, he had basically moved into her condo, despite still renting a place of his own. Tall, thin but strong, and handsome, Nelson immediately became investigators' #1 suspect. But cameras at Purdue Pharma, along with a digital log that registers every time employees enter or exit the building, backed up Nelson's claim that he'd been at work the entire day and so could not have been the murderer. Despite the rock-solid alibi, police did not think Nelson was being completely forthcoming with them. In particular, when they asked him if he was having any issues with his girlfriend or if there was anyone he knew of that might want to harm his girlfriend, he just kind of dismissed the questions instead of trying to help them understand what might have happened. The other 2 promising leads police initially had also led to dead ends. They had tracked that 911 call that had led to the crime scene to a payphone outside of a restaurant about a half-mile away from the victim's condo, but they had not had any luck finding the person who had made that call. And despite calling in the Connecticut State Major Crimes Unit to help process the crime scene, investigators had failed to come up with any fingerprints or trace DNA that might lead them to the killer. It wasn't until 4 months later, when Sheila played the trust game with her husband Paul, that police would finally get the break they were looking for in this murder case. On the evening of March 23rd, the same day that Paul and Sheila had been playing the trust game, Paul woke up in the post-surgery unit of Westchester Medical Center in Pleasantville, New York. He had arrived at the hospital late in the afternoon in critical condition, and the doctors who had operated on him felt like it was a miracle he had survived. After the effects of general anesthesia had worn off and Paul's vital signs were stable, he was moved to a private room to recover. As Paul became fully aware of his surroundings and began to remember the events of the day, he understood even better than his doctors just how lucky he was to be alive. So when an officer from the Westchester Police arrived in Paul's recovery room at 6:23 p.m. that night and asked Paul what happened, Paul was ready to talk. The story he would tell would be so outrageous and so unbelievable that the law enforcement, hospital staff, and the public would be talking about it for years to come. The following reconstruction is based on the information revealed to police in Paul's statement about what really happened to him during the game he was playing with Sheila. After Paul felt that heavy blow to his chest, Sheila began to scream, but her scream stopped abruptly. At the same time, the pressure Paul was feeling on his chest had left him so winded that he no longer even noticed what Sheila was or wasn't doing. He was just trying to figure out what happened to him. And as he lay there, still handcuffed and blindfolded, he felt another blow to his chest, this one even more powerful than the last one. Then he heard Sheila say, "Oh my gosh, I think I hurt you, you're bleeding." Paul could feel himself starting to sweat, and he asked his wife, "Sheila, what happened? What just happened to me?" Sheila sounded very panicked when she said, "It was an accident, it was an accident. I think the candle must have hurt you." Paul could tell that his wife was not handling this well, and that he needed to try to take charge of whatever was going on. And so he told Sheila not to panic, and then he told her to take the blindfold off of him. When she didn't respond right away, he said very clearly and loudly, "Sheila, take the blindfold off." This time, she did as he asked, and when Paul could see again, he could see Sheila was standing over him, looking around the room wildly, like she was totally nervous, and before he could even ask, she said she couldn't find the keys to the handcuffs. Paul looked from his wife down across his chest, which he did not have a very good view of because he's still on his back, to see if maybe there was some sign as to what caused the pressure and subsequent pain he was feeling there. But there was nothing visible on his chest, and there was no blood or anything. Still, he knew something big must have just happened to him because his whole body was starting to react like he'd experienced major trauma. The pain he felt was starting to localize around a particular spot in the center of his chest, and he could feel his heart starting to race. Without the handcuff keys, Paul needed to break the rung of the chair that he was handcuffed to. So he looked back up at his wife, who was still just standing there looking all around the room, and he said to her as calmly as he could, "Sheila, come over here and break the chair." Sheila looked at Paul, and her eyes were super wide, and she very slowly walked over to where he was, and then she knelt down beside him, and then it seemed like it took forever, but she did finally break the chair rung, and so with his hands still handcuffed, but now able to be moved around, Paul attempted to stand up, but the pain in his chest was now so severe he couldn't, so he just kind of rolled over onto his side. Paul told Sheila she'd done a great job breaking the chair, but now she needed to call 911. Sheila looked like she understood the assignment, but when she left the room, instead of calling 911, she just went into the kitchen and poured a cup of juice, and then she walked back into the room where Paul was, and she bent down over Paul and handed him the drink and told him, "Just drink this and you'll feel better." Even though Paul didn't know what happened to him, he knew a cup of juice was not going to help. So, trying not to get angry with his wife, he said, "Sheila, I'm really hurt here. Put the juice down and call 911. I need an ambulance." Sheila, who had a look of total shock on her face, slowly stood back up and put the juice on the desk. Then she seemed to struggle to find her cell phone before pulling it out of the back pocket of her jeans. Once she got her phone out, she put it to her ear, and then she began to run back and forth from the spare bedroom they were in, into the hallway, into the kitchen, and then back to look at Paul. And while she's doing this, Paul could only hear little bits of the conversation she was having on the phone, but he heard Sheila give the dispatcher their address and say that it was her husband and that he was bleeding and they needed an ambulance. When she got off the phone, she came back into the room, and Paul asked her to help him stand up. He needed to get to a mirror so he could look at his chest and see what happened. Sheila helped pull Paul to his feet, and he stumbled into the bathroom, but what he saw just didn't explain the amount of pain he was now feeling. It looked like there were just 2 small marks on his chest, almost like scratch marks. He thought to himself, maybe Sheila had had some kind of seizure and had fallen on him, and that maybe the candle she was holding had some sort of metal component on it, and so when she fell onto him, maybe that metal piece on the candle had punctured his chest. Now, he knew this was a ridiculous theory, but he just couldn't understand what was going on. As he was standing there, Paul could feel himself start to fade, and he told Sheila to help him lie back down on the floor. And then all he could think about was the ambulance. Where was it? How much time had passed? After he was back on the ground, Paul told Sheila to call 911 again, and when he heard her start to talk, he told her to bring the phone over and hold it down next to his ear because he wanted to speak to the operator himself. But Sheila turned away from him and said no, the operator did not want to talk to him, that he just needed to lie still and wait for help. Starting to panic, Paul asked his wife, when was the ambulance going to get here? What did they tell you? Sheila made a shushing motion at him, then told him that they were apparently short-staffed and they wouldn't be able to get there for at least another 25 or 30 minutes. Paul could not believe what he was hearing. He told Sheila that was absolutely absurd that he would have to wait that long for an emergency. But Sheila would tell him that the operator she was speaking to thought Paul's sense of time was probably just off because he was hurt, and that was actually a totally reasonable amount of time to wait. And then Sheila just left the room. Paul figured she must be leaving to make another call to 911, or maybe she was going to get help from a neighbor. Meanwhile, desperate to have the use of his hands again, Paul managed to break one of the flimsy handcuff locks. The handcuffs were still dangling from one wrist, but at least he could now use his hands. With a huge effort, Paul was able to pull himself up to his knees, clutching onto the futon for support while gasping at the pain he was now feeling in his chest. Suddenly, he heard Sheila's voice again. She was standing in front of him, holding a little medicine cup that was full of liquid cold medicine. "Here, Paul," she told him. "This is NyQuil. This'll make you feel better." Paul didn't even answer her. Instead, he just pushed the NyQuil aside, then stood all the way up and staggered out to the living room couch. Sheila followed and sat beside him, waiting patiently, while Paul could literally feel the life draining out of him. Suddenly, Paul made a decision. He had to act now. So he turns to Sheila and he says, "Let's go." She could just drive him to Westchester Medical Center. On a Sunday afternoon, it would only take them about 10 minutes to get there. "Okay," Sheila said, "but let's get your jacket on first." Once Paul had struggled to get into his jacket, Sheila left to go bring the car around to the front of the condo. Everything Sheila did seemed to take forever, and when Sheila did finally get Paul settled into the back seat of the car, instead of taking the direct route to the hospital, she took the scenic route, driving slowly along winding secondary roads. And they hadn't even gone that far when Sheila stopped the car on the side of the road, hopped out, and then opened the door to the back seat and told Paul she thought he should lie down rather than sit up. He looked at her incredulously and just said, "No, get back in the car, just drive, Sheila." And when finally they did pull into the hospital complex, instead of following the clearly marked signs to the emergency room entrance, Sheila drove slowly behind the hospital to a mostly empty parking lot alongside the behavioral health building. Once there, she drove to the farthest end of the lot up on a hill before finally bringing the car to a stop. When Sheila turned off the engine, Paul heard the sound of her car keys getting dropped onto the floor in front of the driver's seat. As Paul started to struggle to sit up so he could get out, he heard the sound of Sheila fumbling around on the floor of the car looking for her keys. When she had finally found them, she opened her door and stepped out into the lot and made her way around to his side. But when she opened his door, instead of helping him get out, she lunged at him. Clutched in her hand was a knife. The same knife that she had used earlier that afternoon when she had stabbed him twice in the chest while he was lying on the ground, blindfolded and handcuffed to a chair. Before Paul could even register what was happening, Sheila was on top of him, raising the knife over her head, and then just a second later, she had plunged it, now for a third time, into his chest. As Sheila started to raise her hand again for another blow, Paul's adrenaline kicked into hyperdrive. As she brought the knife down again, Paul managed to block her blow, and then he pushed her off of him and he stumbled out into the parking lot. Then he turned, and as Sheila charged at him, he reached out and grabbed the blade of her knife with his bare hands and yanked it away from her. Even though his attacker was now disarmed, Paul was critically injured. Sheila's third stab wound had nicked an artery, and blood was now starting to fill his lungs and chest cavity. But as he grappled with Sheila, two people stepped out of the behavioral health building, which was about 500 feet away. Paul, using every ounce of strength that he had, turned and started staggering toward these people, calling out for help. All the while, Sheila was hanging on to him, pulling on his clothes, telling him they really needed to talk and that he had to tell people this was all an accident, otherwise she'd get in trouble. The two people who came out of the behavioral health building could clearly see that there was some kind of a fight going on between this man and this woman, and so they started to run toward them. One of the bystanders was a medical resident, and as soon as he saw Paul's blood-soaked clothes, he told the other bystander to call an ambulance. Even though they were already within the hospital complex, the resident realized that Paul likely would never make it to the ER if he went on foot. No one was listening to Sheila's screams that it was her that was being attacked, and when she changed her story and told the resident to please just leave Paul to her and that she'd get him to the ER, Paul used his last ounce of energy to whisper, "No, get away from me," before he crumpled on the ground. As the residents started to work on Paul right there in the parking lot, Sheila, hearing the wail of the approaching ambulance and police cars, turned and started to run. But just a few minutes later, the police had caught up to her and put her in the back of a police cruiser. A little later that night, at the same time the police officer walked into Paul's recovery room and asked him what happened, a detective was already questioning Sheila, and more law enforcement personnel were out in the parking lot examining the area where Sheila and Paul had been seen fighting. It was out there in the parking lot that the police would find Sheila's cell phone. During her struggle with Paul, she had dropped it before trying to take off and evade capture. Back on the morning of November 8th, 2002, 4 months before Sheila would try to kill her husband. Sheila got up at her usual time, she dressed for work, and arrived at Purdue Pharma at 8:09 a.m. At 10:53 a.m., she left Purdue Pharma, swiping her security badge at the building's front entrance. Then she walked to her car, hopped into the driver's seat, and made the 10-minute drive out to 123 Harbor Drive. It was a beautiful day, about 50 degrees Fahrenheit, clear and cool. The light breeze made little waves in the water where many residents of the luxury condo complex moored their boats. After parking her car and checking her pockets, Sheila also glanced in the rearview mirror to make sure no loose strands of her hair had come out of the tight bun at the nape of her neck. Then she made her way up the flight of outside steps that would lead her to the front door of apartment 105. Once she was standing outside of it, she knocked on the door. As soon as she heard footsteps inside of the apartment walking toward the door, Sheila slipped on the pair of gloves she had in her pockets and wrapped her fingers around the handle of the knife with the 5-inch long blade she also had in her pocket. Then Sheila leaned closer to the door and called out in her friendliest voice, "Hi, Annalisa, is that you? Hey, it's me, Sheila Davalu from Purdue Pharma. Any chance you have a minute? I really need to talk to you." From behind the closed door, Annalisa recognized the voice of her former coworker. "Sheila, wow, haven't seen you in a while. Yeah, just a minute, let me open the door." About an hour later, Sheila was back in her car. She was still flooded with adrenaline and excitement. In the course of killing Annalisa, the two women had raged back and forth through every room in the downstairs of the condo until finally Sheila had stabbed Annalisa so hard that she could feel the thin knife blade sink right up to the hilt, buried in Annalisa's chest. Afterwards, Sheila made no attempt to clean anything up. Instead, she carefully walked into Annalisa's bathroom, and then once she was in there, Sheila spent a minute or two trying to catch her breath, leaning against the scalloped edges of the sink, and looking into the mirror to make sure she'd gotten all of the blood spatter off of her face before going back to the kitchen and picking her coat up off the table. Then she wrapped the coat around herself to keep people from seeing all of Annalisa's blood all over her clothes, and then she walked out the door, got back into her car, and headed for a payphone outside of a nearby restaurant. Once she arrived at the payphone, Sheila called 911. It was only as she was pressing the payphone buttons that she noticed a cut on her right hand that she must have gotten when she was struggling with Annalisa. But right then, the dispatcher picked up the call, and Sheila immediately focused her attention on delivering the script she had so carefully planned. She took a quick breath, and then, without giving her name and while sounding totally upset and panic-stricken, Sheila told the operator in a breathless voice that she had just seen her neighbor being assaulted. As soon as Sheila had given the dispatcher Annalisa's address, she quickly ended the call, got back into her car, and headed for her own condo in Pleasantville, New York. At 1:53 p.m. that afternoon, Sheila returned to work at Purdue Pharma. When she went home that night, she spent a quiet evening with Paul. When a coworker called her late that night to say that their former colleague, Annalisa, had been murdered, Sheila acted completely shocked, but she didn't say anything about it to Paul, because all Sheila was really thinking about now was Nelson Sessler, the man whose girlfriend she had just killed. It would turn out all the crazy stories Sheila had told Paul and her friends and her family about what Melissa was up to, from the crazy sex with the man she was obsessed with, Jack, to the insane surveillance operation this woman carried out on Jack and Annalisa, well, those stories all really happened. They were true. But Melissa was not the woman at the center of them. It was Sheila. Sheila was Melissa and always had been. And Jack, the man she was obsessed with, that man was actually Nelson Sessler. The only real name in the Purdue Pharma love triangle was Nelson Sessler's girlfriend, Annalisa Raimundo, who Sheila killed just so she could have Nelson all to herself. Sheila did have a mentally ill brother, but it wasn't because of him that Sheila made Paul leave with all of his belongings every time he came to town. It was so Sheila could entertain her lover, Nelson, right inside of Paul and Sheila's home. Nelson would later say he truly had no idea Sheila was married. And all those after-work trips to the local bar with coworkers and Sheila's supposed volleyball league she was in, those were just excuses to see Nelson as well. After killing Annalisa, Sheila rushed to be by Nelson's side, and she supported him while he grieved the loss of his girlfriend. And while she did that, Sheila was able to convince Nelson to restart their own relationship. And once that happened, Sheila felt like her mission was complete. She had her man back. And so that was around the time that she stopped talking about Melissa and the love triangle to Paul, which Paul misinterpreted as Sheila distancing herself from Melissa. That was also around the time that Sheila decided she would just have to kill Paul as well, because he was also getting in the way of her romance with Nelson. So she came up with this trust game because it would give her a way to immobilize Paul so she could easily stab him. Even though police had a solid case against Sheila for the attempted murder of her husband, it wasn't until they looked at her cell phone that she had dropped in the parking lot that the last piece of the puzzle fell into place. It would turn out, after stabbing her husband, Paul, during the trust game, Sheila never actually made any calls to 911. Instead, as she raced around the apartment, pretending to be on the phone, and also offering Paul first a glass of juice and then also NyQuil as he lay on the ground dying, the only person Sheila was actually trying to get a hold of was Nelson Sessler. Now that Paul was going to die any minute, she wanted to talk with Nelson and invite him over for dinner at her condo that night. When Sheila couldn't get a hold of Nelson on the phone, she left him several voice messages asking him to come over and join her because she had some fun things planned for both of them. When police examined Sheila's phone, they immediately recognized Nelson Sessler's phone number and discovered what it was that Nelson Sessler had not been forthright about when they interviewed him following his girlfriend Annalisa's death. What Nelson neglected to mention was that he had been seeing another woman, Sheila, at the same time he was dating Annalisa, and he just didn't want anyone to know. It would take police almost 4 years to build a concrete case against Sheila for the first-degree murder of Annalisa Raimundo, and another 4 years before the case actually went to trial. But they got the break they needed when they re-examined all the forensic evidence from Annalisa's apartment. On one of the faucet handles of that bathroom sink with the scalloped edges where Sheila had stood and cleaned herself up after stabbing Annalisa to death, forensic experts found a single tiny drop of blood that must have fallen from that cut on Sheila's right hand. That drop contained the combined DNA of Annalisa and her killer, Sheila Davalloo. On February 19, 2004, Sheila was sentenced to 25 years in prison in New York for the attempted murder of her husband, Paul Christos, and on April 26, 2012, Sheila was sentenced to 50 years in prison in Connecticut for the murder of Annalisa Raimundo. The two sentences are going to be served one after the other. On Monday, June 4th, 2012, 34-year-old Eric Samoa stood between two brand-new Jaguar cars on the showroom floor of a luxury car dealership in Bethesda, Maryland. Eric was talking to a potential new car buyer. Eric was this dealership's top salesperson, sometimes pulling in between $10,000 and $20,000 in commission checks every month. Eric was very handsome. He wore a well-fitted black suit and a red tie, and he was tall with a shaved head, brown eyes, and a goatee. Eric smiled at his potential customer, told him a joke, and then put his hand on the guy's shoulder like they were old friends. But pretty quickly, Eric sensed this guy was not actually ready to buy a car just yet. Still though, Eric had not become the top salesperson at this dealership by giving up at the first sign that the customer is not fully committed. Instead, Eric just continued talking and listening to the guy, doing his best to establish a real connection. That way, when this guy came back and was ready to buy a car, he would hopefully come back to Eric. The potential customer walked around one of the Jaguars and told Eric he would definitely think about buying it. He said he loved how it looked, he just needed to talk to his wife first. Eric said he totally understood, and then he handed the guy his business card and walked him out of the showroom and said he looked forward to meeting with him again. Then Eric turned and walked back across the showroom floor, past all the polished, perfectly lit cars, into a bright carpeted hallway that led to the break room and a few offices. Eric walked into his manager's office and said he was taking off for the day. His manager told him to have a good night, and Eric just grinned, because he definitely had a good night planned, and he couldn't wait to get it started. About 15 minutes later, Eric pulled into the parking lot of his high-rise luxury apartment building in Silver City, Maryland, a suburb of Washington, D.C. The apartment building was the type of place that catered to young professionals, with a rooftop pool and plenty of bars and restaurants within walking distance. Eric walked into the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor, where his place was. Once inside his apartment, he went right to the kitchen and poured himself a drink. Then he headed to his bedroom and changed into black jeans and a black t-shirt, and then he walked out onto a small balcony. He left the door open behind him. Out on his balcony, Eric sipped his drink as he watched the local restaurants and bars down below come to life. Eric loved this part of town, and he loved his apartment, especially because he'd had to work so hard to be able to afford it. Eric was the youngest of 4 children born to immigrant parents from Ghana, and when Eric and his siblings were kids, their parents had told them that the United States was filled with opportunity, and that in the United States, they could be anything they wanted as long as they worked really hard. So Eric had grown up basically believing the American dream was true, that if he put in the work, he would be successful. And looking out from his balcony inside of his upscale neighborhood, Eric felt like he was definitely on the right path. Selling luxury cars had really paid off. He made great money, and he had no intention of slowing down. Just then, Eric heard a knock at his door. He turned around and walked through his apartment and put his glass down on the coffee table, then opened up the front door and saw a 34-year-old Katrina Ben standing there. Katrina smiled, got up on her toes, and threw her arms around Eric's neck and gave Eric a big kiss. Then they both went inside, and Katrina curled up on the brown leather couch in front of the TV, and Eric went to the kitchen to pour Katrina a glass of wine, and then he joined her on the couch. Eric and Katrina had been seeing each other for a few months, but they were still keeping things really casual. They had met outside of the apartment building and discovered right away they had a lot in common. Katrina shared Eric's really strong work ethic, and it's what allowed her to become a nurse. They also both loved basketball, and so their relationship consisted of basically hanging out a couple of times a week, watching a basketball game together, and then spending the night together. And that night in particular, they were both really excited because there was this big NBA playoff game on. And so, sitting on the couch, Eric and Katrina talked about who they thought was going to win the game, and then they also talked about how their jobs were going, but Eric looked a bit distracted. He kept picking up his phone and checking the time. Finally, he just turned and asked Katrina if she was up for going on a quick ride before the game started. Katrina figured he just wanted to go out and maybe pick up some food or something, but no, Eric told her he actually wanted to go meet a guy who he could buy marijuana from. He said the guy lived close and it wouldn't take very long. Katrina was surprised. She knew Eric occasionally smoked weed, but he'd never asked her to go buy weed with him. Still, she figured it wasn't that big of a deal. They were in a really nice suburb, so how dangerous could this weed dealer really be? So Katrina told him that was fine, as long as they got back in time for the start of the game. Eric promised they wouldn't miss a thing. Then he and Katrina left the apartment, went down the elevator, and out to Eric's car. After driving for a few minutes, Eric turned onto a side street in front of a small apartment complex, and he pulled over to the curb and put his car in park. To Katrina, the street seemed totally empty, but suddenly the back driver's side door opened, and this tall, skinny-looking drug dealer with a scraggly beard slid into the back seat. The dealer quickly handed a paper bag over the seat to Eric, and Eric took the bag, he looked inside, and he saw a Ziploc baggie of marijuana, and after he was satisfied, he handed the cash back to the dealer. The dealer then hopped out of the car without a word, closed the door, and disappeared back into the apartment complex. The entire exchange took less than a minute. Eric turned and smiled at Katrina, and then he turned the car back on, and he drove them back to his place just in time to watch the opening tip-off of the playoff game. And then later that night, after the game was over, Eric and Katrina went to bed together. Then, right before Katrina actually went to sleep, she reminded Eric that she had to work early the next day, so pretty likely when he woke up in the morning, she'd be gone. Eric said he totally remembered, then he kissed Katrina goodnight, and the couple rolled over and they both drifted off to sleep. And hours later, in the early morning of June 5th, 2012, Eric was still asleep in his bed when somebody walked into his bedroom, walked across the floor, and stood right beside him, staring down at him as he slept. The following day, so June 6th, Eric's manager at the luxury car dealership sat in his office trying to get a hold of Eric on the phone. Eric was supposed to work that day, but he hadn't shown up, and his phone kept going to voicemail. Top salespeople like Eric occasionally took what everybody at the dealership called unscheduled days off, but Eric always made sure to let his manager know if he wasn't going to come in, and he hadn't on this day. So the manager walked to the showroom floor and talked to a couple of other salespeople, but none of them had heard from Eric either. The manager started to get worried, so he went back to his office and he called Eric's emergency contact, who was one of his older sisters. The manager told Eric's sister he didn't want to upset her, but he hadn't seen or heard from Eric that day. Eric's sister was totally frightened by this, and she immediately called Eric, and when he didn't answer, she called her other sister and her other brother to see if they had heard from him. But they too had not talked to Eric in at least a couple of days. Eric's sister, the one who the car dealership manager had called, had a really uneasy feeling. Eric talked or texted with at least one of his siblings every single day, and so Eric's sister felt like, this was an actual emergency, and so she took a deep breath and dialed 911. After explaining what was going on with Eric, the 911 operator said that police would send officers by Eric's apartment to do a wellness check on him. Eric's sister thanked the dispatcher, and then she went right to her car and raced across town to Eric's apartment building. A little before 5 p.m., Eric's sister waited downstairs in the apartment complex lobby while a building manager led 2 police officers up to Eric's apartment on the 6th floor. One of the officers knocked on Eric's door but got no response, so the building manager unlocked the door and stepped back. At that point, the officers stepped forward, walked inside, and began calling out to see if anybody was home, but again, there was no answer. So the officers walked across the apartment, down a short hallway, and came to a closed bedroom door. One of the officers knocked, but there was still no answer, so they opened up the door and walked inside. And there was Eric laying in bed. There was a sheet that was pulled up all the way up to his mouth. The officers walked over, and they saw there was a single gunshot wound to Eric's head. Both officers thought it looked like Eric Samoa had taken his own life. The officers quickly went back downstairs, and when they got there, one of them placed his hand on Eric's sister's shoulder. He said he was so sorry, but they had found her brother deceased upstairs in his bed. Eric's sister let out a shriek that echoed off the lobby walls. She started wailing and crying. She could not believe her little brother was gone. About 45 minutes after Eric's body was discovered, Detective Dimitri Reuven of the Montgomery County Police Department walked into the lobby of Eric's apartment building. He saw officers standing with 2 women and a man who were huddled together and crying. Reuven was one of the youngest detectives on the force, but he did have experience, and other cops basically envied him for his seemingly boundless energy. He waved one of the officers over, and the officer told him the people in the lobby were Eric's siblings. Reuven asked the officer to let them know that he would be down shortly to talk to them. Then Reuven quickly walked across the lobby and took the elevator up to the 6th floor. Reuven walked through Eric's apartment, and he understood why the first officers on the scene had thought Eric killed himself. The door to the apartment had been locked when they arrived, and there was no sign of forced entry, and expensive items like Eric's computer and TV had been left untouched, so this didn't look like a robbery gone wrong. Reuven stepped into the bedroom, and he saw that Eric had a single bullet wound in his head, another sign of a possible suicide. But Reuven searched the entire bedroom and didn't find a gun, so he knew the officers had been wrong. There was no way Eric had shot himself. Someone clearly had shot him. Reuven looked down at Eric's body, and for whatever reason, he felt this instant connection with the guy. He couldn't really explain it. He'd worked a lot of homicide cases, and he always felt sympathy for the victims. But this was something different. This was more personal. Reuven told himself that the reason for this connection must just be because Eric looked to be about the same age as Reuven. It was like, here's this guy with every opportunity in front of him, and somebody took that away from him. And this just made Reuven really upset and angry. It just seemed so wrong. Reuven took out his phone and called the station to let his boss know that this was a homicide, not a suicide, and so he would need an investigative team sent over. And not long after that call, forensics analysts arrived at Eric's apartment and began sweeping through it. And they would discover a single .380 caliber bullet casing in the bedroom, but there still was no sign of a gun anywhere. They also did a sweep of the apartment for fingerprints and possible DNA samples, but they knew that type of evidence might not get them very far in this case. The fact that there was no sign of forced entry or any kind of struggle meant there was a good chance Eric knew his killer. So the analysts figured they would just find lots of prints of friends or family who were often at Eric's place and so were not suspicious, and any of them could be guilty. And Reuben knew right now 3 of Eric's family members, his sisters and brother, were down in the lobby waiting to talk to him. So Reuben let the forensics team continue their work, and then he headed back downstairs. The elevator doors opened, and Reuben could hear Eric's siblings still crying in the lobby. Reuben walked slowly now, and he heard the sound of his shoes clicking on the concrete floor. He hated this part of the job. Eric's siblings only knew that their brother had been found dead in his apartment. They didn't know what happened. So Reuben lowered his head and approached them, and he told them he was so sorry, but their brother had actually been murdered. That sent Eric's brother and sisters into another fit of screaming. Detective Reuben stood with them and let them get as loud and as angry as they wanted. Then eventually, one of Eric's sisters caught her breath and wiped the tears from her eyes, and she looked right at Reuben, and she told him he needed to speak with a woman named Denise Harrington. Reuben asked who Denise was. Eric's sister said Denise was Eric's girlfriend, and she was no good. She was 20 years older than Eric, and his entire family knew Denise was just using Eric for his money. Reuben thanked Eric's siblings for their time, and he said police would follow up with them soon. Then he offered his condolences again and headed back upstairs. When he got there, he could tell, after hours and hours of searching this apartment, really the only thing investigators had found so far was just that bullet casing. But Reuben felt like this Denise person was a really strong lead, and so it didn't really matter right now that they didn't have much evidence. So Reuben found the phone number for Eric's girlfriend, Denise, gave her a call, and when she picked up, he told her he needed to meet with her to ask some questions about her boyfriend. The day after Eric's body was discovered, members of Reuben's team re-interviewed Eric's brother and sisters and looked into other family members who might have spent time at Eric's apartment. But Reuben himself remained focused on Eric's girlfriend, Denise. At the station, he led Denise into an interview room, sat across from her at a small wooden table, and handed her a bottle of water. He thanked Denise for coming in, and then asked her if she understood why she was there. And she just said, I understand there's some questions about Eric. Reuben nodded, and then asked her very gently if she knew that Eric had been killed. A look of total shock came across Denise's face, and she just began shaking her head, no, and then just said she couldn't believe it. People loved Eric. Reuben watched Denise very closely. She looked genuinely surprised and upset about this news, but he knew some people were naturally just very good actors. Looking at Denise now, it also struck Reuben how big the age gap was between her and Eric. Eric's family clearly had not approved of a woman 20 years older dating their little brother, but Reuben did not think being older than Eric somehow made Denise more suspicious. Reuben asked Denise if it was strange that she hadn't heard from her boyfriend in the last couple of days, before he was killed, but she told him it was not strange that she hadn't heard from Eric because Eric was actually not her boyfriend. Not anymore, anyways. Reuben was confused. Eric's siblings seemed very certain that Denise was seeing Eric and using Eric as far as they were concerned, but Denise explained that she and Eric had hit a rough patch about a month earlier. She found out he was obviously cheating on her when she noticed text messages coming into his phone from 2 other women. And so Denise just did not want to be treated that way, and so she had ended it with Eric, like their relationship was done and she had not talked to him in a while. And Denise said, if somebody close to Eric thought that she, Denise, and Eric were still together, it was probably only because Eric had not told anybody about the breakup. Denise felt like, Eric likely wanted his family to think he was settling down and not still going out and seeing a bunch of different women at the same time. Finally, Reuben asked Denise where she was on the night of the murder, and she said she'd been at home and said police could check her phone records that would prove she was telling the truth. Reuben thanked her for her cooperation and said he would be taking her phone now so they could download the information to help corroborate her alibi. And a little later that day, after police had finished downloading the information from her phone, Reuben gave the phone back and let Denise go. And while Reuben did think Denise was genuinely shocked when she heard the news about Eric, he couldn't help but think, Denise had a clear motive to want to harm Eric. Eric was cheating on her, and a jilted lover almost always had to be considered a viable suspect. But for now, Reuben would just have to wait until his team went through all of that information downloaded off Denise's phone to figure out if she really was a viable suspect. So in the meantime, Reuben headed back up to the 6th floor of Eric's apartment building to talk to some of Eric's neighbors. Reuben knocked on a door that was nearby Eric's apartment, and a guy in his 20s answered. The young man did not look surprised to see a detective standing there. He said he knew Eric pretty well, and he knew Eric had been killed. Then, without being prompted, he told Reuven the police should really question Eric's girlfriend. Reuven said he'd already met with Denise, but the young man just kind of stared at him, and then he said no, Eric's girlfriend's name was not Denise, it was Katrina. If you recall, Katrina was the woman who watched basketball with him on the night he was killed. The neighbor told Reuven that Katrina lived in the apartment building, and he had seen Eric with Katrina a bunch of times. Reuven thanked the young man for his help, and then the door shut, and then Reuven just stood there in the hall thinking. Denise had mentioned during her interview that 2 women had been texting Eric, which is how she had figured out he was cheating on her, but neither of those 2 women were named Katrina. And Eric's family had never mentioned anybody named Katrina at all. And so now, Reuven thought he might have a jilted lover in Denise and a secret lover in Katrina to consider as suspects. Reuven really wanted to make sure he was fully prepared before he brought in Katrina for an interview, so he and his team did some digging. They found out Katrina was from Mississippi, and she had come to Maryland a few months earlier to work as a nurse for the National Institutes of Health, a government organization focused on public health research. But much more important than that, at least to Detective Reuven, was that several people in the apartment building saw Eric and Katrina together on the night before Eric was killed. A couple of days after Eric was killed, Detective Reuven found himself back in an interview room talking to a woman he thought was Eric's girlfriend. And just like he had done with Denise, he started the interview by asking Katrina if she knew why she was there. And Katrina, who had a sort of confused look on her face, told him that, she understood she was here to help with some investigation, but she hadn't been given any more details than that. She figured it might have something to do with where she worked, but she didn't know. At this point, Reuven told her point blank that her boyfriend, Eric, had been found murdered in his apartment, and that she was the last person anybody had seen him with. Immediately, a look of complete disbelief came across her face, and as she pulled her legs up onto her seat and grabbed her knees with her arms and began rocking back and forth, she began saying to Reuven that, why would anybody want to do this? Everybody loves Eric. And then she asked Reuven, is it possible that this was not Eric? But Reuven said no, this was definitely Eric, and he is definitely deceased. At this, Katrina clutched her knees even tighter, and then she looked up at Reuven with a very sad look on her face, and she said, she just felt so guilty. For the past couple of days, she'd been furious at Eric because he had not been responding to any of her text messages. And so she thought he was just being a jerk for some reason, but now she knew why he wasn't responding. It was because he was dead. That realization was like too much for Katrina to handle, and for a minute, it seemed like she might have a total breakdown. But then she stopped rocking in her chair, and she put her feet on the floor, and she leaned forward. It was like something had just clicked in her mind. She told Reuven that something really strange had happened on that last night that she was with Eric. Reuven leaned in and asked Katrina to please walk him through everything she could remember about that night. Katrina took a deep breath, and then she began speaking. She said she and Eric had met up to watch basketball, but they left his apartment so Eric could go buy some weed. Then, after Eric got his weed, the couple went back to Eric's apartment, they watched the game, they had sex, and then they went to sleep. None of this seemed very out of the ordinary to Reuven, and he was about to say as much, but Katrina said, hold on, the weird part happened the next morning. She said the next morning when she woke up around 5 a.m., because she had to get up really early for work, she had looked over and Eric was not in the bed. Then she heard voices coming from some other room. She thought maybe Eric was on the phone, so she just got dressed, grabbed her things, and walked out of the bedroom, and the drug dealer who had sold Eric the marijuana the night before was standing right there. Katrina said this totally freaked her out. Doing, a quick weed deal in the car was one thing, but having a drug dealer in the apartment at 5 a.m. seemed wrong to her. And being a nurse for a government organization, she did not want to be associated with any drug dealers. But that wasn't all. Katrina said when she looked at this dealer, this tall, skinny guy with a scraggly beard, he seemed really agitated. And when Katrina told Eric she was leaving, the dealer turned and looked at her and walked over, grabbed her arm, and basically rushed her out of the apartment and then shut the door behind her. Reuven got Katrina to give him as many details as she could about the dealer and about the location where he had sold Eric marijuana the night before, and after taking all that down, Reuven stopped for a second because he thought of something. He asked Katrina, why didn't you check in on Eric later in the day or really at any point over the next couple of days when he wasn't responding to her text messages? Like the last thing you saw was Eric alone in his apartment with the sketchy drug dealer who rushes you out the door and shuts the door behind you. You said the drug dealer seemed agitated, so what? You just figured everything was fine and you just didn't think to follow up? Katrina could see how suspicious it seemed, but she explained to Reuven that her relationship with Eric was very casual. They basically were not a girlfriend and boyfriend, they were not a couple, they were just kind of hooking up periodically, and that was it. And so Katrina said, she just was worried that if she really aggressively followed up trying to get in touch with Eric and, went over to his place to check on him, that might come off to Eric like she was this really obsessed girlfriend, and she just didn't want that. And then over the course of a couple of days, when Eric did not get in touch with her, she got mad at him. Why is he not getting in touch with her? And so it just kind of led to this silence. Reuven nodded and then thanked Katrina for coming in and told her he would be in touch if he needed more information from her. Not long after Katrina left, Reuven's team worked to track down that drug dealer. And with Katrina's description of him and the exact location of where Eric purchased that marijuana from him, it didn't take them very long to find this guy. His name was William Woodfork, and he quickly became the focus of Reuven's investigation. A couple of days after the interview with Katrina, Reuven sat back down inside the interview room with William Woodfork. William was tall and lanky with a patchy beard, just like Katrina had described, and he was very, very nervous seeming. He was having a really hard time sitting still. Police had not told William why he was here, and so Reuven figured William was likely very worried about getting busted for dealing drugs. But Reuven acted like he didn't notice, and he just casually reached into a folder and pulled out a photo of Eric, and he placed it on the table in front of William, and he said to William, "This man right here in this photo is a guy named Eric, and he was just murdered." And then Reuven asked William, "How long have you known Eric?" William looked down at the photo, and after staring for a second, he just shook his head and said he'd never met the guy. Reuven smiled a very knowing smile and then told William it was not a good idea to be lying to the police. This is a homicide investigation. This is about as serious as it gets. Reuven told William he had Eric's phone records, so he knew William had texted Eric the night before Eric got murdered. Immediately, William hung his head and stared at the floor and then began backtracking. He admitted to Reuven that actually he had sold Eric weed a few times, including on that past Monday night. At this point, Reuven stopped smiling, and he immediately asked William, "Okay, fine, you sold him weed on Monday. Why did you go to Eric's apartment early on Tuesday morning at around 5 a.m.? William immediately looked up and told Reuven he was not some big-time drug dealer out settling scores. He's like, "I had nothing to do with Eric getting killed." But Reuven was not about to take the word of someone who had literally just lied to his face. And with the phone records and William admitting he saw Eric the night before the murder, Reuven felt like he had more than enough evidence to pursue this lead further. So not long after that meeting, Reuven secured a warrant to search William's apartment. And when they did search his apartment in the week following Eric's murder, police would find a .380 caliber handgun, the same type of handgun that had been used to kill Eric. And so Detective Reuven was pretty much positive he had just found Eric's killer. But later that week, when the ballistics report on Williams' gun came back, it showed the ammunition used in his gun did not match the bullet casing that was found in Eric's bedroom, meaning this gun was not the murder weapon. Reuven was not willing to totally eliminate William as a suspect. It just seemed too coincidental that this guy would happen to have a .380 caliber handgun in his apartment, but it could be just a bizarre coincidence. And without more compelling evidence, he knew any case brought against William would not hold up in court. And so suddenly, Reuven felt like this investigation had just stalled in a major way. Investigators went from believing they had their killer right back to having no idea who they were even looking for. And at the same time, Reuven began getting daily calls from Eric's sisters, but he had no new information to share with them. And Reuven told other investigators that he felt like he was letting Eric's family down. Weeks passed without any new leads coming in, and then several months went by, and pretty soon this case became much less of a priority for the department. But Reuven refused to let the case just go cold. In fact, he put a photo of Eric on his desk to remind him of the job he still needed to do. and he continued to talk to Eric's sisters almost every day, and he promised them as long as he was on the force, he would never stop looking for their brother's killer. In May of 2013, almost a year after Eric's murder, Detective Reuven continued his investigation. But almost no new evidence had surfaced, and so he was basically running out of ideas. Reuven pored over Eric's case files whenever he could, looking for anything that he might have just overlooked. And there was one piece of evidence, or really a missing piece of evidence, that had always bothered him. The gun that had been used to kill Eric had never been found. So now, Reuven decided to try something he knew was a total long shot, but he felt like he had nothing to lose. Police often confiscated guns as evidence in investigations, and they occasionally received guns that people had simply found and turned into them. So, Reuven reached out to every police department in the county and asked for a list of all the .380 caliber handguns they had received in the past year, either confiscated as evidence or turned into them by a Good Samaritan. The other departments all cooperated, and soon Reuven ended up with this list of 60 .380 caliber handguns. And then Reuven began the painstaking work of tracking down the history of each of those 60 guns. And the first 58 guns led him nowhere. But when he began looking into the 59th gun on the list, he thought he might have found something promising. That gun had been found discarded on the side of the road on the Capitol Beltway, one of the busiest streets in Washington, D.C. The man who had handed this gun over to police had been sitting in bumper-to-bumper traffic and just happened to look over and see the gun lying on the side of the road. And that spot on the Beltway was not very far from Eric's apartment. But there was another detail in this report about this 59th gun that gave Reuven the biggest jolt of energy he'd felt in almost a year. The man who found this gun had found it just 2 days after Eric's murder. Using the 59th gun's serial number, Detective Reuven tracked down the weapon's original owner, but that man told Reuven he'd actually sold the gun at a pawn shop years earlier, and so Reuven found that pawn shop and got their sales records for the gun, and from there, Reuven started tracking down every one of the gun's previous owners, and there were quite a few of them. And this process dragged on for weeks and weeks, but finally, right around the actual 1-year anniversary of Eric's death, Reuven talked to a man who had sold this 59th gun to a pawn shop just a few months before Eric was killed. And so Reuven felt like there was a legitimate chance that whoever had bought the gun from this latest pawn shop was the killer. Now, the pawn shop was nowhere near Reuven's police station, but he decided he would take a trip there, hoping all of his work would pay off. So, on a hot and humid June day, Detective Reuven, along with several other officers, walked into the pawn shop on the outskirts of a small rural town. Reuven thought it was the kind of place someone would never find unless they already knew it existed. The pawn shop owner greeted Reuven from behind the counter in a very thick southern drawl, and he asked how he could help. Reuven told the owner he was looking for sales records on a particular gun, and then he gave the owner the serial number of the gun. But the owner right away just sighed and said he was really sorry, but he couldn't do that. He'd stored those sales records in diaper boxes out in a shed behind the shop, and earlier that year, rats had gotten into the shed and started gnawing away at all the diaper boxes. The owner was worried he would lose the records to the rats, and he knew losing gun sale records could get him in big trouble with the federal government, so he handed over all those records inside of the chewed-up diaper boxes to the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, Firearms, and Explosives, or the ATF. The ATF is a United States government agency that primarily monitors firearms trafficking. Reuven just stood there and stared at the pawn shop owner. He felt like laughing at how absurd this was. He never imagined diaper boxes and rats would play a role in his homicide investigation, but here he was. And so ultimately, Reuven thanked the owner and then left the pawn shop and headed back to Montgomery County, Maryland, to the police station. And once he got there, he called an ATF agent that he knew and told him what had happened. Reuven offered to go to ATF storage and personally dig through all the chewed-up diaper boxes himself, but the agent assured him the ATF would find whatever he needed. And on June 12, 2013, so over a year after Eric's murder, Reuven got a call at his desk from that ATF agent. And the agent told Reuven that they had just tracked down all those diaper boxes, and they had found the specific report Reuven was looking for, and so he was faxing the report over right now. Reuven thanked the agent and hung up the phone, but as soon as he did, he felt so nervous. It was like every muscle in his body was getting tense. He knew if this report that he was about to read didn't give him any new information, he would have no idea what to do next. And so as he was thinking about this, he looked over at the photo of Eric on his desk and just held his breath. The fax machine near his desk started printing out the report. Reuven got up, walked over to the machine, grabbed the report, and began to read through it. And as he did, Reuven felt like a huge weight had been lifted off his shoulders. After more than a year of investigating this case and weeks of tracking down gun owners all over the place, Reuven knew, based on this report, that he could call Eric's siblings right now and tell them he had found their brother's killer. Based on records from the ATF and evidence collected over the course of a year, here is a reconstruction of what police believe happened to Eric Samoa in the early morning hours of June 5th, 2012. The killer was standing at the foot of Eric's bed, watching him sleep. They'd been standing there for a few minutes, just staring, but they knew now it was time to act. So they reached into their bag that was slung over their shoulder and pulled out a .380 caliber handgun. The killer then walked forward until they were right next to Eric, trying to be as quiet as possible. They didn't know what Eric would do if he suddenly woke up. And so at this point, the killer kind of leaned over Eric until they were so close to him they could actually feel Eric's breath on their cheek. Then they slowly pulled up their gun and aimed it basically point blank at Eric's forehead, and then they fired. The bullet lodged inside of Eric's brain, and he died without ever waking up. The killer quickly tossed the gun into their bag and then pulled the bedsheet up to Eric's mouth to try to cover up some of the blood. Then the killer ran out of the bedroom, slamming the door shut behind them. They opened up the front door, they locked the doorknob, and then closed it, and then they ran down the hallway to the elevator. As the elevator was making its way down, the killer took several steadying breaths, doing their best to look as calm as possible. When the elevator doors opened, the killer walked across the lobby, went out to the parking lot, got in their car, and began driving towards Washington, D.C. Now, it was still dark out, and the killer saw headlights up ahead from a line of cars driving towards the city, and so since they didn't want to get caught in traffic, the killer just hit the gas and whipped down the road. The killer reached the Capitol Beltway in D.C. before traffic got too bad, and at this point, they rolled their window down, reached into their bag in the passenger seat, grabbed the murder weapon, and threw it out the window. The first chance they had, the killer turned around and sped back across the Maryland border. About 30 minutes after fleeing Eric's apartment, the killer walked back into Eric's apartment building, except this time, when they got in the elevator, they did not go up to the 6th floor. They went up to a lower floor. And then once they got to that floor, they got out of the elevator, walked down the hall, and went inside of their own apartment. And once they were inside, they showered, put on a nurse's uniform, and went right back downstairs to go to work. Katrina Ben, Eric's basketball-loving, casual romantic partner, was Eric's killer. It would turn out Katrina wanted a lot more out of her relationship with Eric. She did not like the idea of it being casual. And the week before the murder, Eric had blown off Katrina on a night they were supposed to hook up. Katrina knew Eric was out with actually another woman, and she told him she was not okay with that. But Eric was just not ready to be in a fully committed relationship with Katrina. In fact, he didn't even want his family to meet her. So Katrina started to feel like Eric was only using her for sex, and it made her really angry. So angry that she decided she would kill him. When Katrina first arrived at Eric's apartment to watch the basketball game, she had the gun with her, but she just wasn't sure if this night was going to be the night that she actually followed through. But Eric's impromptu drug deal gave Katrina potential cover. She could make up a story and say the dealer had shown up at Eric's apartment and seemed really suspicious, and basically make it seem like the drug dealer had killed Eric. However, the dealer, William Woodfork, had nothing to do with the murder. He had never even been to Eric's apartment. It took Detective Reuven tracking down the gun that was used to kill Eric and delving into the gun's history to finally discover Katrina was the killer, because he had traced the gun back to a pawn shop in a small rural town in Mississippi that just happened to be Katrina's hometown. Now, at this point, Reuven was very sure Katrina was the killer. However, he needed a receipt that showed she was the one who bought this gun last. But when he went to the pawn shop in Mississippi, those sales records were in that shed getting destroyed by rats, and so they had been shipped to the ATF. But Reuven was able to get those records from the ATF, and as soon as he looked through them, he saw right there Katrina's name was on the record. She had bought the murder weapon. She definitely was the killer. And so Katrina would be arrested at her parents' house in Mississippi, and she would be found guilty of first-degree murder and sentenced to life in prison, plus an additional 20 years with no chance for parole. To this day, Eric's family say it was Reuven's patience and determination that ultimately got justice for their little brother and gave the family some sense of closure. Thank you for listening to the MrBallen Podcast. If you enjoyed today's stories and you're looking for more strange, dark, and mysterious content, be sure to check out all of our studio's podcasts. They are this one, of course, MrBallen Podcast, and we also have MrBallen's Medical Mysteries, we have Bedtime Stories, and also Run Fool. To find those other podcasts, all you have to do is search for Ballen Studios wherever you listen to your podcasts. To watch hundreds more stories just like the ones you heard today, head over to our YouTube channel, which is just called MrBallen. So that's going to do it. I really appreciate your support. Until next time, see ya.